Today on TwinCam I'm going to show you how to grease the suspension on your classic car. But first of all, why do you need to grease your classic car? Well, modern cars tend to have sealed bearings, which means that once the bearings are greased in the factory, they never need to be greased again. They are sealed completely and never need to be touched. But classic cars tend to have grease nipples, and I know there are some trucks in the United States, stuff like that, heavy machinery that still have grease nipples today, but the vast majority of passenger cars don't. My Metro, being a more than 40-year-old design now, designed from the 1970s, does have grease nipples. There's one on each corner of the car. On the back, for example, the trailing arms, they have the bearings at the end that allow the car to pivot up and down on the suspension, and they require greasing quite regularly. If you don't grease the suspension, well, then your bearings start to dry out, and then eventually your car starts to become creaky. Also, you start to get premature wear. On a Metro, for example, you can tell that the rear end of the car is worn by the way it's sitting. If you've got quite a lot of negative camber at the back, then the bearings are quite badly worn. So that's why it's mega important that you get your grease gun out and you do it. Now, there'll be a lot of people watching this video who'll think this is a really simple thing to do, and yeah, it is. But there are lots of people out there, lots of people my kind of age, who won't lay a finger on their cars, not because they can't or they don't think they'll be able to, but because they're afraid of breaking their car. And that was something that I have felt a number of times, but this is something that's really easy, and it's something really important to do to keep your car on the road. Of course, in order to do this job, you will need a grease gun. This one costs 9 or 10 quid or something like that. Really not very expensive, from Halfords, and the grease to go inside it can be found pretty much anywhere. There are lots of videos on how to load these things. I don't have a spare canister of grease, and this one is full of grease, so I can't really show you, but there are loads of other videos showing you how to load your grease gun, so that's not a problem. Well, what else will you need? Well, you will need a jack, obviously, because you want to take the weight off the wheel of the car you're working on. You also need a jack stand, because don't ever jack your car up and not secure it properly. You also need usually kitchen roll, but this is all I have at the moment, so toilet roll will have to do in order to clean up the grease nipple, and something to clean as well. Now, I was going to do this in the garage, but I think, for clarity's sake, I think I'm going to do it outside, so allow me to back the car up the garage. Of course, your standard jacking rules apply here. Always use a jack stand. I have the handbrake on, I have it in first gear, and I've got a brake under that wheel to chock it as well. That jack isn't supporting the car, there is an axle stand underneath. That's just resting just shy of the jacking point in order to provide some kind of fail-safe in case the jack stand collapses. But you'll see on a Metro, there is one of the grease nipples there. Will that focus? There you go. There is one of the grease nipples. In order to find where the grease nipples are in your car, all you need to do is look in either your owner's manual or look in any kind of good workshop manual. Haynes manuals usually have all of them in there, and that will show you where all the grease points are. But you see, there is one of them. This same grease nipple is on the other side of the car, and there's one behind each of the front wheels. Now that I've got it cleaned off a little bit, you can see the grease nipple a little bit more clearly. And these grease guns have a standard kind of end on them, so that they just slot, if I can get it on with one hand. Can I aim this? No. See, they just click on. It's as simple as that. And then eventually you'll see underneath the car, you'll see grease starting to come out of the other end of the joint. That way you know the joint is full. Now, if you're in a garage and you don't want a messy floor, a good option is just to slide a piece of cardboard underneath the joint, so that any grease coming out just falls onto the cardboard and there are no worries. Now, once you've finished greasing, people who've never done this before might worry that they can't get the grease gun off and they don't want to break it. Well, if you just pull and just move it about a little bit, it will just eventually come off like that. There are no worries about breaking anything. Just pull and it will come off, don't worry. Now, if you start pumping and nothing seems to be happening, or grease starts to come out of the joints of your grease gun, either just tighten up the joints on the grease gun itself, or your grease nipple might be blocked. And now, if your grease nipple is blocked, it's very simple. I can't remember the size of this bolt, but
you can just put a socket on, undo the grease nipple, and the grease nipple will come out. It's about that big or so. And then once you have that off, you can clean it off with some degreaser and try and unblock the grease nipple. Usually your problem will be that the grease nipple itself is just blocked at the end. Once you clean it out, it'll all be okay. You can screw it back in, nip it up, and then start pumping again, and everything will be okay. And once you've noticed grease coming out of the joint, you're done. You can let the car down off the jack, back onto the ground, and then you can do the same on the other side. I'm not going to show you doing it on the other side because that would be completely pointless, so I'm going to move to the front. Now on a Metro, the front grease nipples are behind the front wheel. You can do it by jacking up the car and putting it on full lock, or you can just take the wheel off, and that's what I'm going to do because it's easier. Now that we've got the wheel off and we're under the front end of the car, it's a good time just to check to see if there's anything wrong here. Have a look at your rubber brake hoses, see if there's any play in anything, have a look at your brake pads or brake shoes depending on what kind of car you got. Obviously my car, there is a little crack in the pulley there, but that's fine, there's nothing really terrible about that. And yes, I do have a splash guard missing, but that is something that I'm working on. So at the moment we will see just there, that is the grease nipple on the front of the car. You can't really see it unless you know it's there because it's so caked up with mud, just due to the location of it. But I'll clean it off and then we will pump some new grease into that joint. You see, now that I've cleaned it off, it's much clearer where that grease nipple is within the front suspension. So now I'll get my grease gun and we'll start greasing again. This is where it can be incredibly useful to have a grease gun that has a flexible nozzle, because this one just about fits in here to that grease nipple. But if you've got a slightly bigger grease gun or one of a slightly different shape, it might not fit. So getting one with a flexible nozzle is always a really good idea on cars. You'll see now that I've pumped a bit of grease in, you can see the grease starts to come out of this joint here. Now it's really important, especially with the grease nipple at this kind of angle, that your grease gun is dead onto it, because if not, the grease will just start to come out around the nipple, and it may fake you into thinking that the grease nipple is blocked, but usually it isn't. You're just at the wrong angle. And so as long as you are dead on to that grease nipple there, the grease will go in and you'll start to see grease coming out of this joint here. It's another nice idea while you're here to adjust things like alternator belts while you've got the wheel off, and access is incredibly easy. On a Metro, it's just that bolt there at the front that you can get up at from the bottom, and then this bolt here, which you really can't see because my camera works awful, but there is a bolt there, bolt up at the front there. That's how you adjust your alternator belt. It's worth doing things like that while you've got the wheel off, and while you have to have a wheel off, you might as well check everything, adjust things, and make sure everything is in good working order before you put the wheel back on. It saves you in a week's time realising that you need to adjust your alternator belt or something like that, and then having to jack the car up and get the wheel off again. So now we've done one side of the car, I shall go and do the other side of the car. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was helpful to a few of you at least. If I've got anything wrong, feel free to leave an abusive comment underneath. And if there's anything that you'd like me to do with the channel, feel free to leave a nice comment underneath. But for now, I'll see you in another video.